Hello, and thank you for joining me again today on the Finding Hope After Loss podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Today, I am talking with Janis, who is a trauma-sensitive movement specialist. In this episode, she talks about the ways that trauma shows up in our bodies, along with how movement can help us process the trauma after going through pregnancy or infant loss. Hello, everyone. Today I am here with Janis. Janis, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I can. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And second, I am a trauma sensitive movement specialist. And that is a really specific title, but I work with women. This isn't my only kind of person that I work with, but I do work with women who have experienced pregnancy and infant loss. So I'm working to bring movement as a therapeutic modality to women who have had that experience in their life and help process that traumatic experience.
What is it that led you into that specific, very specific field?
That is a really specific field. So, kind of zooming out, I actually have been a movement practitioner for about 20 years almost. And I noticed quite some time ago, most of my work is actually private clients. And I noticed that when I was working with people, there were a lot of emotions that came to the table along with motion. So emotion paired with motion. And I didn't actually feel prepared for the amount of trauma that was coming into my studio. And of course, in those days, I didn't even have a word for that. It seems kind of odd to me almost in a way, but we didn't really have a conversation culturally about trauma until about 10 years ago. So at the time when this was happening, I went down the hallway to another practitioner who had a therapeutic practice, and I asked him, what do I do with all of these really difficult experiences? And he was the one that pointed me in the direction of trauma trainings. So although I didn't necessarily set out to kind of work with this really specific demographic, it is work that I absolutely love. So I basically pivoted my practice after adding some really specific trauma modalities to working with people who need extra support. And that actually is a whole bunch of audiences, including people with cancer, people who have long COVID, people who have pain, people who have pregnancy and infant loss, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a specific demographic that I love because I have had some challenging experiences in that area myself. So I just absolutely love being able to support that particular demographic.
As always, I think that is a demographic that always needs more resources because there certainly are not enough.
Yeah. And I think it's one where women end up in a scenario where that's usually quite unexpected. And then there is just sort of what do I do? Where do I go? How do I move forward? And if a woman has not done quite a bit of trauma work or perhaps therapy in the past, sometimes it can also feel like, why is this taking so long to move out of my body? I've gone to the groups, I've gone to the support places, and I still feel this sometimes years and even decades later. So that's kind of one of the really specific and special challenges of this demographic, because it is something that usually we're not seeking out in advance. We're not prepared for it. We're not gathering resources when we first find out that we're pregnant or having challenges getting pregnant. It isn't until the really trying and difficult situations happen, and then it's just sort of a flood of what now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think it's one of those things you could never really be prepared for until you
Mm-mm.
actually go through it yourself. And
Absolutely.
then, people expect you to just go back to being normal right away, and they don't. It's like you're not allowed to have the trauma of it, but it's
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and I think my work with the group that I work with, it also looks a lot of different ways. So obviously, pregnancy is a really long period of time, and there are many entry points to loss. or exit points. So that can vary quite a lot from woman to woman. So it isn't a universal experience necessarily either. There's women that I've worked with that have had medical terminations. There's women who have come to full term. There's women who have had loss after IVF. There's women who've had loss early on. And there's women who actually have non-viable pregnancies. And all of those have their own nuances. There's also, and this is really important, there's women who have children and there's women who do not have children. And then there are women who have pregnancies again, and there's women who don't. So, I mean, the number of nuances kind of within what is branded as one category are very many, and just depending on that person's kind of particular loss and what that looks like, and where she was in her life, and the other components that are going on, it can really impact us very, very differently, even depending on what age we're at.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we all go through loss and go through some of the similar feelings, but you're right that, not even two miscarriages aren't alike. Every
Yeah.
experience is different.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the reasons that I love this particular work, because we're not focused on kind of those details. It's really focused on getting the body moving and to use movement as a way to move it through the body. I would say in all circumstances, I only work with women who've had loss who are also doing kind of support groups and or some kind of therapeutic methodology. But I think this technique can be super helpful in moving energy and or accepting stillness in the body. And that can be really critical after loss as well.
So what is it about the movement that helps with trauma?
Good question. So I kind of bubbled this out at the beginning, but I'm going to just slow it down and back up and kind of explain what the modality is. So it's a really specific certification called Trauma Center Trauma Sensitive Yoga. So that is the whole title of the certification. Is a bit of a mouthful, to be honest. So the trauma center component at the beginning of that is Bessel van der Kolk's Trauma Center. And for those who are not familiar, Bessel van der Kolk is a psychiatrist who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score. So some of you may have heard of that. Some of you may have read it or listened to it. And for those who are not familiar, if you are in any way familiar with the concept at all, that the body holds trauma, the body holds emotion, there's a high chance that you've heard of that in the last 10 to 12 years. And that's a direct result of Dr. van der Kolk's work. So if you have read that book, basically it goes through kind of the whys and the hows and quite a detailed explanation of exactly what's happening with the body when it comes to trauma. And in the back part of the book, and I remember reading it and thinking, okay, most of this book is really about how we got here. Now, how do we get out of here? And he does talk really briefly about movement, art, music, connection, community, things like that. So 20 years ago, he partnered with a man named David Emerson to start looking at yoga as a modality. So all of that is kind of a precursor to the modality that I'm trained in actually is that specific modality. So at this point, it has actually broken apart from the trauma center, but because of the nature of where it came from, there have always been clinical research components to it. And I'm kind of sharing all of that because it's actually the only movement modality I have, and I have many of them, that is actually evidence-based. So that's really, really special and important. And so what that actually means is that as a facilitator of this work, I'm not guessing, I'm not kind of making it up. It's not based in, spiritual components. It's actually based in double-blind clinical controlled studies. So we know that it is actually as effective as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is huge because that's actually been the gold standard of moving trauma through the body up until very, very recently. And so some of the components, I will name them for you, that are actually those evidence-based components sound really, really simple, but they are the reason that everything works. First and foremost is choice. So we know that in all circumstances where somebody has a traumatic experience, they have lost choice over their body. So some of the ways that we integrate it into the work are cueing that sounds like this. If interested, you may choose to raise your arm. If interested, you might do that at any speed, moving it any amount. Your hand can be facing the ceiling, your hand might be facing the floor. And so again, while that sounds really basic in how I'm describing it, part of what that does for a woman who has been through a trauma exposure such as loss is it gives us the practice of having choice back over our body. And that's so important because that's one of the reasons, quite honestly, that we get stuck, so that we can't move forward. We keep reviewing everything in our mind, what happened, where did it go wrong, etc. And that's all really cognitive. But what our body needs to do is really have that feeling and that knowledge, deep information that we have choice again. Another component that is evidence-based is attunement. So when we do have grief and loss, it can be really helpful to go to support groups because we're able to share. We have people that really deeply understand. What can also be helpful is being in another room with somebody who, in this particular case, so I have a very regulated nervous system. Having gone through all this work, that is actually part of what makes me able to teach it. So then a participant can come and regulate with me so that we're not always attuning to others who have that same sense of grief and loss. So that's really important. And I would encourage you, whether it's, through movement or another modality, to seek out a facilitated group where somebody in that room actually does have that regulated nervous system, because humans have social nervous system where we literally pick up what somebody else is, where they are emotionally, and we match that. So a great example of that is actually on television. The old school television used laugh tracks, because when we hear laughter, we are more likely to laugh or to smile or to think that something's funny. And then some of the other pieces, I'm not going to kind of name them all, but are interoception, which is being able to read the signals of our body, and then taking effective action, which is when we have that choice, we notice what's in our body, and then we can make decisions. So those are kind of a few of the pieces. And so the way it's put together, it reads like a yoga class, but there's actually quite a lot of science behind what we're doing as facilitators and why we're doing it. And like many other kind of therapeutic modalities, it's not magical. But the magic is in the practice and having a different experience and being able to move through the body. Actually, I missed one that I do want to mention: rhythm. That's a really big piece of it. So we apply some rhythm to the body, and that tends to help again with the nervous system. And so it's a really specific kind of modality that is helping the nervous system to process what the brain cannot. And so what we can do in any given class is we can take trauma is really when we have an experience that's too much for the body to process. And so if we're able to release 1% of it, or 0.5% of it, or 10% of it, I don't actually have specific numbers on what it is, but if we're able to just move a little moment and a little bit, that is actually what we know is really helpful.
And I think it's so interesting to learn all the science behind it too, because, a lot of people just think, oh, like yoga. Okay. So I just do a
Yeah,
couple poses and like
exactly.
supposed to be healed from my grief, but I
Yeah.
really, the part that really sticks with me the most is, taking back that control over, you can do it, giving you the choice, because loss does make us feel so out of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is the underpinning behind every single cue, instruction, every single class. And without that, it is not trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga. So that's a really good one to kind of pick up on. And my experience with it is that we get choice back, but then we're not actually sure exactly how to implement that. And what I encourage, if you do not have someone in your local market like myself, is that actually there is a podcast for this particular modality, and it's not directed towards women with loss, but you could look that up. And the second piece is just knowing that you can actually implement that yourself in small ways in your life does tend to really be a game changer. So if we've never thought through that concept, we just kind of keep on keeping on. But if we actually say, I've lost choice, how do I reclaim it? Quite often we will find ourselves doing things that are different in both small and big ways.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times we're just expected, like, okay, this is where you need to get to, but we don't
Yeah.
know how to get there. We
Yeah.
don't know the steps.
Yeah. And I think that is a really important thing to say, because we really have a society that says, you're allowed to grieve, and then they assign a time. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have worked with women at all stages of loss for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of levels of quote unquote choice. And so, just depending on what that looks like, my experience is that women have been assigned different time periods based on from other people what that is. And that's the first piece of the choice that we really need to kind of examine, because it doesn't matter if your coworker thinks you should have it processed because your loss was in the first 12 weeks. If that's not what you're feeling, that's a choice to just, not engage with that person on that topic, for example. And it's a choice to actually feel those feelings and process the loss. So just knowing that we have a lot of choice, even if the loss itself wasn't a choice.
Yeah, and again, I that's something that I struggle with a lot. I like to be in control of everything, and then the more I go through life, the more I learn that I'm in control of nothing.
Yeah. And that's such a good follow-up comment, because control and choice are not the same thing. So we don't necessarily get control, but we might have choice. And I think you're not alone in wanting to control everything. And in fact, I know you're not alone there. But when we think about what those differences are, I think that's something to definitely examine in our own lives, because we aren't in control of anything, or everything rather, but we might have choice over a lot of different little micro pieces of our lives. And that includes how we're moving, who we're engaging with, the amount of rest we have, the amount of sleep we have, whether we want to go to a group session, whether we want to go to a private therapist, whether we want to take a pause from any or all of that. Those are kinds of pieces that might be choice, even if some of them might have a little bit more control and some of them might have a little bit less control. So I'll just give you an example. So let's say that we have a coworker who thinks that we should have processed the loss. We don't have a control over whether we have to work typically, but we may have a choice in whether we speak to that person about our feelings.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that is good that you like make a distinction between the two, because I think sometimes they're used interchangeably.
They are, and they're to our body and our nervous system, they're actually quite different.
So I'm sure that there's no like one answer to this question, but how do you know if you've, I don't want to say like worked through all your trauma, but like how do you know that you're working through it, going in the right direction? Like are there signs your body gives you or something along that?
That's a really good question. So I think a few things. Number one, so I just sort of embedded it into some of the evidence-based commentary, but that interoception piece is a really big one. So interoception basically means, if I was to ask you, what do you feel and where do you feel it? One of the body's coping mechanisms is to turn off our access to sensation to the body. And so that's where it kind of links back to, not all of that might be from the loss. So we may end up in a scenario where a loss pushes us to a place where we need to start doing therapeutic work, or we may have to kind of connect on that deeper level to us. And for some people, just depending on your childhood, different traumas in your life, your entry point basically into this, you already might have experienced a lot of trauma. You might have none. So I've worked with people with both. So interoception is one of the pieces that we might lose. So if you're moving your arm and it is uncomfortable to be in your body, we know that, we haven't actually fully processed. That all said, different people have different capacities for interoception. So I've met people who can feel every little thing, and I've met people who can feel some stuff sometimes. And then the amount of verbiage we're able to put to that also differs. So that comes on a spectrum. But essentially, if you're finding that sitting in a room with your eyes closed is making you just want to jump out of your body, we probably kind of haven't moved through it. Another kind of piece is hating our body. So when we feel angry at our body, or things like those thoughts where you're thinking like, oh, this body has failed me, what's wrong with me, stuff like that, we probably haven't kind of moved through that fully. Another piece that participants in my pregnancy and infant loss class will share is the idea that they feel a sense of stagnancy. So I taught last weekend, and about half the room said that they hadn't actually felt that sense of movement in quite some time. And so when we do a movement and then you realize, this has been stuck, that's a big piece, because I actually really don't like the concept that's floating around this, is that we can quote unquote heal from trauma or heal from different circumstances, because I think in a lot of ways that suggests that we're going to be the same as if it has never happened. So that's the medicalized idea of if you get a paper cut on your finger, it might bleed, it might hurt, but at some point you can't even find where the paper cut was. I think that for most people, pregnancy and infant loss doesn't ever read like that. There is no time in your life when you're like, okay, that experience is basically gone. I can't find it. I can't remember it. That doesn't work that way. So I think what we're looking for is the capacity to integrate. It's not even to move on. It's to integrate where we know that it happened. We can speak or feel or have that experience without it being completely overwhelming. We do feel like we're able to find joy and other experiences in life without guilt, shame, heaviness. And it doesn't mean that there won't be little spikes of those moments, but when we just feel like shut down, stagnant, stuck, that's when we know we kind of need to do some more work to move through it. And those might come in waves. Moments where women are pregnant again can bring up a lot, even if we've processed a lot and we kind of moved through a lot. So there can be other kind of catapults where we do need to actually do a bit more work. But I think that those are kind of a few of the pieces that I see quite regularly where it's going to benefit us to do a bit of work to try to reclaim some agency over the situation.
So do you see people who are also pregnant then after loss?
Mm-hmm. I do. Yep. And so I sort of see a spectrum of women who have decided not to continue trying to conceive. I see women who are actively engaged in IVF process post-loss. I see women who are pregnant, and I see women who have other children and there's some, the additional children are actually, they've already given birth, etc. So there's kind of, again, I think that's important to mention. There's a whole range, everything from the woman never tries to conceive and or cannot conceive again to the woman goes on to have one or more children subsequently and is still needing processing work. So I think the longest I have seen is about 12 years later, just for a reference point. And that doesn't mean that everybody needs to kind of process for 12 years, but it's important to kind of say that because it isn't something, again, where we just have another baby and okay, we're over it.
Right. Yeah, I think that is important to mention. Everyone thinks, okay, because like you were saying earlier, people put a timeline on it. Like, okay, it's been a year, like let's move on. Like you made it past the year. But I'm 6 years out now and I still miss her every day. I don't cry every day, but I still miss her every day.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's a normal piece of an expected emotion. And so I think is so important from my lensing. We're not looking to have like an emotionless life and we're like, I feel nothing about this. But, you just shared you miss her. But you were able to do that in a way where your voice didn't break. You didn't start crying. You didn't shut down. We didn't have to stop the podcast recording, things like that. And had those things been true, there would be no harm or foul or anything negative about that. But it says to me that you've processed enough that, you can move on and help other people with their processing. And when I say move on, again, just to be super clear, it doesn't mean that you don't have feelings. It doesn't mean that you don't connect to others with this particular challenge. What it means is that you actually have movement in your life.
It's so interesting to hear all this. Trauma is one of those, I mean, it's interesting, but it's something I wish we all didn't have to deal with,
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, I have never yet met a traumaless person. And in fact, there is actually research, this is good to know as well, that when people have no traumas, I don't even know how they found people with almost no trauma, but we actually have no resilience. So basically there is kind of that Goldilocks number of traumas in our life. And I believe it's 3 to 7. So when we kind of get over 11, that's where every subsequent trauma is really high risk in terms of the impact to us. And if you get under 3, you basically are a person without much resilience for traumatic experiences. So there's kind of 2 sub points to make there. One is that if you were a person coming into this with 7, 8, 9 existing traumas, this is going to be harder because our capacities are different than somebody who's had fewer. But second, just knowing that, I mean, I'm sure every single person listening to this wishes that this hadn't happened. And, I'm with you on that in terms of, I don't wish this would happen to anybody either. That said, we all are going to have really trying circumstances. You are not alone in that. If you think that the average mentally and emotionally healthy person has 3 to 7, that means most people have some very trying circumstances in their life. And this happens to be one of yours.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we can't ever judge people just by looking at them. People who look happy doesn't mean they haven't had their share of trauma, may just be different than ours, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And even within the pregnancy and infant loss community that I'm with, there are women who have years and years of IVF and then experience loss. And you can't tell that by looking at people. They have to tell you. I don't walk into a room and kind of I can't identify who has had how many losses and when they were and at what point they're in their pregnancy. I don't know any of that information. So you're right. It's really an invisible burden. And I think that's part of what makes it really challenging to process through the body, because we have to disclose that to people if we want to get support. And then you have to be really mindful about who you're sharing with, because we don't always find supportive people.
Right. Yeah. And I know you touched on this a little bit, but you can't, I guess, hope it's not a dumb question, but you can't like work on one trauma and not work on the others, right? It's kind of a whole
thing. Yeah. 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 No, that's it. That's actually a really, really good question. That nobody's actually asked me before. That is important. So I lens my work through, a lot of it is really related to the nervous system, but all of it is related to using movement to process trauma. And I do actually have like a talk therapy certification as well. So if somebody does talk about it, I'm trained to be able to engage in that. However, even I would say when we're using a psychotherapeutic approach, we can really hone in sort of on that. Let's discuss one trauma, let's discuss one incident, and it can get really granular in terms of we can process one person. When we're talking about our body and our nervous system, the body doesn't really differentiate between trauma A or B or C or D. And that's part of what's actually amazing about this work, because it it allows us to kind of titrate a little bit of our body, and it allows us to open the tap a little bit, and then we can close the tap. And it can be a small amount, it can be a large release, it can be whatever the body's willing to kind of give. And so I think there's benefits in both approaches. I mean, I think my experience with a psychotherapeutic approach is that we can learn skills, we can learn language, we can learn techniques. Those are all super helpful. But this particular work where we're moving through it with the body, it's really nonverbal, which is super cool because you're just processing kind of random stuff in a way. Which actually means that for some people we have to do more of it, because there might be a lot in our lives that need to be processed. I mean, I was in my 40s before I really did any trauma therapy, and there was a lot that had built up already. So the great news was I didn't need to go into specific details of every incident and every person and every situation. It's just sort of the more I practice this work, the more that movement supports emotional health in my life.
I'm sure it can probably bring up some unexpected things for some people. Like,
oh yes,
I didn't know I was holding on to this.
Yeah, I mean, I will share this quite openly. When I started my training for trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, I don't remember how far in I was, not very. And I ended up crying because just that choice piece just was overwhelming to me. Now, all of that said, in any teacher training scenario, we tend to do things that we would never do in real life. Like you're, doing 5 or 6 hours of yoga, and then I'm like sobbing. And that's not how it's delivered to the general population. But I think it's worth noting because there was just stuff hanging out in my body that, despite having gone through, 100 hours of psychotherapeutic training not that long before, there was still just this overwhelming wave of, whoa, I have never felt like this before. I have never had this experience before. And I share this with almost all of my participants. I think there's also, when it comes to choice in our body and movement, there's layers of things that have nothing to do with kind of even traumatic experiences. If we're in female bodies, we typically have a lot of instructions given to us about our bodies, how we're supposed to walk and stand, and how we dress, and how we're supposed to look. And in fitness classes, it's very typically quite instructive. And so there's layers and layers of things that exist here when it comes to the female body that are not even things that most of us would consider trauma, but they're system-based trauma. Like, we have evidence that 12-year-old girls think about what our bodies look like, and when we ask 12-year-old boys about their bodies, they talk about what their bodies can do. So, there's pieces here that are typically interlayered and interlaced in a lot of ways. And to the question you asked earlier, we can process kind of all that at once.
Yeah, I never even really thought about that, but that is so true that we're, always told, like, in great detail, like even by like medical people, by, by everybody. And, we're just kind of like, okay, we just kind of do what everybody says.
Comply. Yeah. And actually that's a great point to bring up medical people, because the more medicalized that we have, the more of a medical system we've encountered, typically the more we're carrying as well. So I have met lots of clients and students for a whole host of reasons that have had a lot of medical touch. And the medical system has a lot of value and benefit. That said, it also can be quite dehumanizing, quite patriarchal, and quite instructive. And so what I'm specifically referring to with your audience are, if we've gone through IVF, if we've had a late stage loss and had diagnostics attached to that, sometimes those diagnostics don't feel accurate, but it's all that we get.
Right.
Things like that can really be quite impactful. Again, just in terms of, we're told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, why to do it, and you just do it, right? And so we're carrying all of that, and that adds to the pile.
Yeah, and even like you said earlier, we're told how to grieve, when to grieve, how long to
Yeah.
grieve, and just
Yeah,
add on top of all that.
exactly right. So all of those things contribute, some in really overt ways, some in very covert ways, and some are somewhere in between. And some of them we're not necessarily aware of until we start to do some of that processing work. And some of those things are things that our grief or loss groups don't ever bring, because they're just things that we don't even realize. Partly because we're all, again, living in a system.
I feel like going through this, you would learn just so much about yourself. Even, I
Yeah.
mean, not even despite like just the trauma,
Mm-hmm.
like all kinds
Yeah.
of stuff.
Oh yeah. I agree. And it is an interesting process, because we often think of movement and exercise as the way to lose weight or have a certain kind of body or whatever it is, but they're all very external. This is really internal work. So it is one of the things I love about movement so much is that no one can move for you. So, I mean, I guess you could get a massage, but there's a few things that, like, other people, you can't outsource it. You can have somebody clean your house, you can outsource childcare, you can outsource a lot of things, but you really can't outsource movement and exercise. So that's a really fundamental piece of body ownership. It's a fundamental piece of how we experience every single component of our life. I mean, our five senses are held within our body. Most people's memories really link to something that had some emotional resonance. So when I think back to being a kid, like, a lot of the things are sort of silly, but I remember when I was like 9, I lost my windbreaker jacket. And but what had happened really in my body, I had kind of that pit in my stomach and a little bit of that fear and anxiety. And so my body was like, "Ooh, this is an important thing to hang on to." And so most of us will think back on and remember things that had a bit more of that. And so they could be happy memories, maybe getting married or encountering an old friend or something. But all of that really comes down to our nervous system and the sensations in our body. And so exercise and movement are tools to actually integrate and to be one with our body and to understand what's happening in our experience and to make choice. But unfortunately, the sort of fitness culture machine has made it so that it is a way to achieve a certain exterior look. And this work is, somebody one time said, and I kind of agree with it, it's kind of what intuitive eating did for people that are eating. This is sort of the same concept for people moving. It's really about noticing, naming, having experiences in the body, having that sense of, I've moved energy through, or my nervous system has calmed down, or I feel, for some people, they feel energized. Some people feel calmer. And then being able to own your own experience and make choice with it.
So is it something that people can go home and still practice
Oh
at
yeah.
home?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think usually the first few times it's good to have a bit of facilitation, because it does tend to be so different than kind of our traditional yoga classes or movement classes. After that, I definitely encourage my participants, especially if they're feeling anxiety and heaviness are two things that come up really often. And so just grabbing those little nuggets from class, grabbing those little moments, they were like, "Oh, I actually felt better doing that." And the way that I teach is really, it is supposed to be accessible to do at home, so that we can repeat it. I never want to teach something that is shrouded in mystery or that somebody can't do on their own, because I think movement is something, it is like eating, where we should be doing it every day. And so how do we do that in a way that is also beneficial to us?
Yeah, kind of expanding on what you said, I think you're spot on about, exercise being just about the outside appearance, and we've taken out the whole like mental health aspect from it, as we do with a lot of things.
Everything, yeah.
So then it feels like if you're not, running as fast as you can or like doing all this intense cardio, that you're like that it's not real exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. And my experience just as a human being, when we are trying to process a lot of heavy stuff, some people actually do excel when they're doing a lot of cardio and kickboxing and whatever it is, but many people don't, where we can feel worse after we do it. That was kind of my experience, is the more burned out and the more kind of heaviness I was processing and the more overwhelmed I was, the worse traditional exercise would feel. So actually for me, this is really key to not having pain, not overdoing things, being able to listen to my body, and having something that it can be intense. Like we could do this methodology in sweat, but also usually when we start, we don't, because we want to be able to tune into a few of those nuances. So it is, for me, in my experience, it allows for movement to be something that's not just like I have to be the most intense ever, because sometimes life is just the most intense ever and we don't have any little extra chunks to be giving away.
That is very true. I think we already stretch ourselves way too thin.
Yeah.
There's nothing
Exactly.
left sometimes.
Yeah. If you're processing all this and trying to work and perhaps have another child, etc., if you find kickboxing to be really restorative for you, do it. But if you don't, maybe down regulating is actually a benefit to you.
So I'm not sure if you know, but are there a lot of people that are out there doing the kind of trauma work that you're
Um,
doing?
that's a good question. I know that it's a growing piece. So I think when I took the program, they had certified about 400 people. So it's fairly small, but I think subsequent classes are larger and larger. So I think just the prevalence of trauma work in our culture and our society has really come to the forefront of attention in the last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years.
About time,
And
right?
yeah, exactly. And so there's increasing volumes of people who are doing this work. I would say the specific program that I did is quite specific in terms of, it's not for somebody who just wants a little bit of trauma informed information. It is really about movement meets trauma work. And I do think at this point, we still have more therapists going through these programs than movement folks. And I'm coming from that movement angle. But, revolutions don't start overnight. So it will continue to kind of increase as the years go by.
Yeah, I mean, it's serious when it makes you work through your trauma to go through the program, right?
Yeah. Yes. And I want to highlight that comment, because we can't complete any of those programs until we've done the work ourselves. So that's actually one of the standout features that differentiate trauma-based programs versus non-trauma-based programs. The beginning components of all of those programs are about the practitioner working on themselves, because we're going to be regulating with people in the room, co-regulating. And typically what that means is that other people are entering the room not in a fully regulated space. So that means I have to be able to maintain that regulation no matter what's around me, or attempt to. And so there's a lot of work that has to go into these things just on a personal level.
So I know you work with women, but is it something that also works for men as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. So I do have male clients. Yes. And then I'm thinking of my group work, because I'm teaching mostly specific special populations groups. They do tend to be women. I'm going to be honest. I do find at this point in history that typically, although a lot of kind of the trauma research and the trauma teachers are men, I do find that a lot of people who are willing to do the work are women, and that's just a personal choice. Or I suppose in this case, we're talking about pregnancy and infant loss. It's someone who's kind of almost been forced to confront this. But I do find when it comes to I teach in a therapist's office, for example, everybody in that group is female. And I think it's because they're making that choice to do that work. And I think at some point that gender divide will kind of start to close. But at this point, yes, I work with men. it does.
They have to be willing to do it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It does work on the male body, and it is worth noting. And I sort of referenced that a moment ago, but when we kind of look at the trifecta of people who really popularized trauma work in our culture, Peter Levine, who is in his 80s, I believe, Bessel van der Kolk, and I might be getting their decades slightly wrong, but he's 70-ish. Gabor Mate, who's in his early 80s. So we're talking about like men who've been doing this. Stephen Porges has been doing research since the 50s. So again, he'd be in his 70s or 80s. So they are men. And I actually, it is notable that we do have a bit of that gender gap between who founded the work and who's doing the work. But I have hope. And, I think that one of the things I would like to see, I know the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Center where I teach does mixed gender groups. So when you have a loss, you can come through the whole experience. Either partner can attend. But I think it would be helpful if the male presenting partners actually did this work as well, because they're carrying a lot of emotion and a lot of support needs. Again, they need to be regulated. So I would love to see more men co-attending the classes that I'm teaching at the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Center for that reason.
Yeah, pregnancy and infant loss centers don't seem to be a common thing. I wish they were more common. Are there many in your area? Are you the only one in your area?
We have a really amazing one here, and I can't actually speak highly enough about it because it's a physical location, but they also offer online programming. So I'm teaching in the physical location, but there is a whole wraparound service that comes with it. So you can go to groups, and that's at any phase. They have online programming. They have programming that's led by staff. They have programming that's led by peers. They have programming. Obviously, they've brought me in to do the therapeutic component for movement. I wish that was an available choice for every woman in every city because it's so needed. I think when we look at, I can speak to myself on this one, but when we look at the benefits of doing trauma work and emotional work, I think it just makes a person more capable, more productive, more competent in every, like, in a 360-degree scope. And so if we're leaving women unsupported through this terrific trauma in their life, I think it creates years and years of basically stagnancy and coping strategies to work around it. And that's what we know from the world of trauma, is that when we experience a trauma, it's overwhelming. If we do not process it, we will cope around it. So it will end up being something that looks like function, but isn't actually function. And some of those coping strategies we know are really negative. Things like heavy alcohol use, gambling, things that are really addictive. And some of them are just not as obvious. So we may see people over shopping or over exercising or completely emotionally shutting down. And so when I talk about being kind of capable and competent and productive, it really just means that you're aware of everything that's kind of happening and responding to it. Whereas the coping strategies are just like, whoop, let's push that out. And your body's typically looking for ways to feel good. So those coping strategies themselves are not intended to be negative. They're intended to make you feel good in a way. And so that's really why this work is so, so, so important, because we know that if you do not process it, it will come out of you in some way at some point, at some time. We also know that it often is really common to take a long time for you to. So if you don't have a pregnancy and infant loss center near you, and you just kind of march on and carry on and hope that it goes away, there is some research now. This is quite old, so I haven't seen any kind of replacement research, but it was actually done on World War II veterans. It took them on average 20 years to process the trauma or to step forward to get an intervention. Now, there was a few things. One, that was men who were 20 when it happened. And so that was one of the hypotheses, is that when we kind of head towards middle age, we have less resiliency, we have more things to cope with. So it's not clear on, if that was to happen to somebody who's 35, would it take them 20 years? Maybe, maybe not. Which is knowing that if we take no action and we just sort of grip the sides of our armchair and hope that it goes away, it probably doesn't. And so it will come out at some point when you're not expecting it necessarily, often at a time when you've got something else that's really heavy that you're trying to process because we're overwhelmed. Or you may end up with a little bundle of coping strategies. And coping strategies, again, I mean, it's might be simple things that are fairly harmless, like shopping, until one day you kind of wake up and realize like you own too many things, or that you have no money, or whatever it is. So those don't tend to actually help us process the trauma, even though they feel at the moment like they do.
Yeah, and mine, whenever I've tried to push it down, because I'm sure we've all tried at some point, it usually explodes at a moment that is not the best.
Yeah, exactly right. So, I mean, this is easy for me to say from this vantage point, but I really truly believe that it's to people's benefits to take steps to try to process what we can. That said, I totally, again, recognize that not every person has access to a pregnancy and infant loss center. And, the one in my local market is actually offering services at no cost. So that sometimes cost is a huge barrier. The one thing I would mention is that there are kind of resources that 10 or 15 years ago would have been really challenging to find. And your podcast is a great example of one of those resources where there isn't a cost to listeners. So if you don't have access to kind of those full wraparound services in your market, there are really amazing resources that are available now for free on the internet typically.
I love that they're offering it for free too, because that's just removing yet another barrier that many people can face.
Exactly.
Loss.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think it's just, I'm really proud that I teach there, and I'm really grateful that I get to teach there, because it's providing just a tremendous service. And I think it's really forward thinking of them as well to include trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, as opposed to just kind of our old school therapeutic talk therapy, which does do a lot. And I think it is really necessary, but I do also see the limitations in it where we can talk. I'm certainly someone who's like this. I can talk and talk and talk. And there's a point when it actually has inverse benefit to me, where I need to be heard. I need to be understood. I need to perhaps get some strategies, but then at some point it flips into like rumination or dissection, or kind of just covering the same territory over and over obsessively. So if you are somebody who's kind of engaged in groups, talk therapy, etc., and you find that you relate to that statement that I just made, this is a modality that I would definitely encourage you to try.
So if people wanted to find out more information or connect with you, where could they go for that?
My business name is My Body Couture, which is 3 words. First word is my, M-Y. Second word is body, B-O-D-Y. Third word is couture, C-O-U-T-U-R-E. So for this specific population, I would actually just recommend sending me a direct message. So you can do that through my website or any social media platform where I'm active. You'll find me at that business name. So you can send me a direct message, and I can send you a couple of resources. Specifically, if you tell me where you are, that would be helpful. And so I can help link you with a practitioner in your area if you have one. If you don't, I can send you the name of the podcast that has some of this material. It isn't specific to the pregnancy and infant loss community, but it will give you the same tools and facilitation. I can let you know, to the best of my knowledge, if there is a pregnancy and infant loss center locally. Again, I don't have in-depth knowledge of the entire planet, so caveat on that. Bonus points if you live in my market, because I definitely know that one. So yeah, I'll do what I can to direct you and to send you whatever resourcing that I can. So yes, definitely just connect with me, send me a message, and let me know how I can help you.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing all this amazing information with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very honored to have been here.
Thank you so much, Janis, for sharing all of this amazing information with us. I honestly learned so much and didn't realize just how many ways our body holds on to the trauma. I think often we think of trauma and grief as things that happen in our brain, but we don't often think about how much deeper it goes than that. We don't realize many of the things our bodies are trying to tell us. Often we may even think our body is trying to fight us or just not cooperating, when we actually need to stop and listen to what it is saying. I know this is something I have not always been great about. It's hard because we sometimes feel a lot of anger towards our body, especially after losing a baby. And learning to love our body again can be really tough. I do feel that we should try to think of it in terms of trying to heal our body from the trauma it's carrying, rather than in terms of trying to, quote, fix it to the way it was before. We won't be the way we were before. It's an unrealistic expectation. But we do deserve to heal, both mentally and physically. Remember, this is the only body we ever get. That is something that has always stuck with me. I try to remind myself of this every time I'm angry or upset at something my body is doing or not doing. It can be a work in progress, and I'm not saying it'll happen overnight, but it's definitely something that we could all stand to work on. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, we are all in this together.